I'd like to welcome everyone to the Pacific Seminars series with the Australian Centre for Pacific Islands Research, where today we are diving deep into the world of chocolate with our very own ethical Willy Wonka. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Bridget Horsey and I'm going to be hosting the seminar for you today. We're really fortunate to have researcher turned entrepreneur, Dr Richard Markham. So welcome, Richard. Richard has worked mainly in Africa, Latin America and Europe on biological control, integrated pest management and genetic resources conservation. Of course, before he came to Fiji in 2008 as research program manager for the new Pacific Crops program of the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, otherwise known as ACPIR. Now, after almost 10 years of managing research for development projects across ACPIR's Indo-Pacific region, he retired to Fiji to set up a small business and try his hand at achieving sustainable development outcomes in a private sector context. So the title of Richard's presentation today is Agroforestry, Ecotourism and Agribusiness, how a tree-to-bar chocolate maker seeks to contribute to developing sustainable livelihoods in rural Fiji. So Richard is going to be sharing with us today a little bit about how he is using ethical business practices and ecologically based production methods to build a small-scale chocolate enterprise known as KokoMana in Fiji. So selling high-quality chocolate products and tree-to-bar tours to local and international tourists, Richard's aspirations go beyond economic survival. He wants the company to contribute to sustainable development in the northern division of Fiji by helping communities to develop agroforestry and ecotourism as alternatives to kava production for more sustainable livelihoods. Well, I think I speak for everyone here today when I say that this is going to be a very interesting presentation. Now, before I do let Richard take over, I wanted to just let everyone know that if you do have any questions for Richard today, please don't hesitate to add them to the chat and we will be allowing some time for questions at the end. Also, if you are new to our seminars, please introduce yourself in the chat. We really would love to know a little bit more about you, who you are, where you've come from and what brings you with us today. Now, I won't take up any more of your time and I'll pass you over to Richard. So thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Without further ado, welcome to KokoMana. As you can see from the picture before you, that's a little chocolate factory in the forest. Dwell for one moment on the picture itself because it tells a little bit of a story. The huge trees there are rain trees, which are not part of the Pacific flora. They are from South America, like cocoa itself, but they're legumes. They are the, if you like, the engine room of our soil fertility. It may look to you like a natural forest, but it's actually a very heavily degraded forest that used to be an Anglican mission, and then I think it was a resort, and then left derelict for a while. And then we took it over and we are trying to restore it in various ways. The little, the brown leaves that you can see in the foreground are cocoa itself. The greener ones are coffee, which already tells you something about our production system. And the sort of the biggest tree that you can see apart from the rain tree, slightly to the left of your screen, is a ilang ilang. That's Cananga odorata, the garland tree. Probably the commonest tree on the block nowadays. So that's the fragrance in Chanel No. 5, but also much beloved by our local fruit pigeons, which is why we tend to keep them rather than cutting them down. Anyway, without further ado, let's plunge into this. I'm going to start, if I can get the technology to work, by sharing with you a very brief history of chocolate, how it came from Central America and South America to the South Pacific. So naturally, Cocoa theobroma cacao is a rainforest understory tree from the neotropics, quite a broad range from the Amazon basin reaching up into Mesoamerica. We used to say that it was domesticated in Central America by the Olmecs, but a team of French archaeologists has recently pushed back the history of domestication much further from doing some rather nifty molecular biology on artifacts from La Florida in Ecuador. They've found traces of domestication use of cocoa 5,500 years ago. And it must have been presumably spread by human agency up into Central America. And the last line there, 1,000, comes more into historical times. About 1,000 years ago, we start to see signs of cocoa in Mayan hieroglyphs. And take 30 seconds to teach you the only word in Mayan that I know is cacao. So ca is that little fish that you can see there, which is widespread in Guatemala. You put 2 dots over its forehead, so it becomes caca. And then you add the word for bread, which is ao, which is the sort of thing that looks like an ear underneath the suffix. And there you've got cacao, which is the Mayan word for cocoa, and the word that passed into Spanish and French as cacao, the name of the cocoa tree. So by the 16th century, when Europeans first encountered cocoa with the Spanish conquest of Mexico, it was already hugely important in Aztec culture. It was used as a currency. It's obviously a characteristic of currencies that they shouldn't be too common. So cocoa wasn't grown in the Mexican highlands where the Aztec civilization was centered, but was demanded as a tribute from more, what should we say, more peaceable agrarian peoples like the Olmecs and Mayas that the Aztecs had subjugated. The Aztecs considered the cocoa to be a gift from their god Quetzalcoatl, and used it widely in various ceremonies. So it wasn't a people's drink, a popular drink. It was used by the elite and was given, for instance, as a pickup drink to warriors going into battle and things like that. And it's quite interesting, the first European cultivation of cacao was not as a food or beverage drink, but as a bank. I think the Spanish planted the first cocoa plantation in Hispaniola in about 1528 or something like that, as a source of currency to help them fund their expeditions in the Americas. So the use of cocoa as money survived beyond the fall of the Aztec Empire. And so this is from the Mexican silver town of Tlaxcala, price list from 1545. As you can see, you can buy 30 cocoa beans, will buy you a rabbit. What I found interesting about this list was that already they were conscious of quality. Grant Binning will like this, that shrunken beans were worth 20% less than good fully formed ones. So hurrying on quickly, the Spaniards brought cocoa back to Europe in about 1520 something. It was a bit of a curiosity to start with. The Spanish court had the idea of adding sugar to it to make it, rather than chili, to make it a sweet drink, but it spread pretty slowly for the next 250 odd years, from the Spanish aristocracy to the French aristocracy to Italy. They say that Spanish nobles carried it around as a physic drink to pep them up when they were on their travels, keep them healthy. And it wasn't really until the 19th century, sort of the first half of the 19th century, that it really became a serious commercial product, when the Quaker industrialists in England, people like John Cadbury, Joseph Fry, and Joseph Rowntree, had the idea that it was a bad idea for working people to spend their days drinking gin, and they should drink healthy cocoa instead. And so they sort of industrialized it, developed machines for crunching and grinding it, and then there were key innovations from the Netherlands, Van Houten, who figured out how to separate out the cocoa fat so that you could actually make a chocolate bar. And then Nestle, who a vaguely familiar name in the world of cocoa, worked out how to make dried milk and make milk products into chocolate, and so the modern product we know. But the bit that we're interested in let's go back to the mid-19th century, became a commercial crop across the growing European colonies around the tropics in Africa and the Pacific and so on. And according to the researches of Grant Binning that I've drawn on heavily here, introduced to Fiji, Samoa, Solomon Islands, New Hebrides, the Bismarck Archipelago of Papua New Guinea, really pretty much at about the same time, between 1870, 1880, perhaps a little bit later, was rapidly adopted as a commercial proposition. So let's just take a step back into the biology or the botany to see what was introduced. They used to say there were two kinds of cocoa, the criollo or native type, which was what the Europeans first encountered in the Spanish Aztec contact in Central America, and a melanado or forastero types from the lower Amazon. Thanks to some good molecular biology work by the US Department of Agriculture, Montemayor and his colleagues, we now know that actually there's about 10 or 12 different kinds that are as different from one another as melanado and criollo, but we'll come back to that very briefly later. But for our purposes, there were the two kinds, and they were brought together at the Imperial College of Agriculture in Trinidad. These so-called Trinitario hybrids were made, and they've been remarkably durable, if you like. We still have growing on the farm varieties like ICS1, which is the Imperial College selection #1 from Trinidad. So what do these look like? Well, things are working well. Those colorful pods on the bottom left of your screen is a typical harvest from our farm. They would all be regarded approximately as Trinitario types. They're not very uniform, but they tend to be big pods with big beans, mild flavor, high butterfat content. They're not varieties in a sense that a plant breeder would recognize as stable varieties, but through some work by the Queen's Department of Agriculture and Forestry, some using the molecular markers from the USDA, we've now got genetic fingerprints from quite a lot of our trees. Those are some of the results up in the graph in the top. 7 of those trees are pretty solidly Trinitario. You can see their genetics are pretty much 50% criollo, which is the orange part, and 50% melanado forastero, that's the blue part. The exceptions, the one on the left is a commercial variety from Venezuela, which for part of the 20th century was the world's biggest producer of cocoa. And the multicolored one in the middle is actually from the Papua New Guinea breeding program, which, as you see, has picked up some of that diversity that I mentioned in the upper Amazon. So we're growing them all together. We're trying to figure out which of them are useful for making good cocoa, good chocolate, I'm sorry. One of the things that's kind of key to understanding, I'm going to talk probably more about cocoa than coffee in this talk, but so I hope you won't disappoint too many of you who came here just for the candy bars. But what's happened in world trade is that over the second half of the 20th century and into our century, world trade has really been taken over pretty comprehensively by melanado type, forastero type cocoa. The forastero type cocoa, they're usually small, smoother yellow pods, rather like this one, although in fact, by a quirk of genetics, that is not a forastero, that's the one from Papua New Guinea, this one with the strange genetics. But what they've because of disease resistance, high productivity, they have obviously taken over 95% of world trade. But then we as quirky, small volume chocolate makers are interested in the remaining 5%. And we're perhaps fortunate in the Pacific Islands, at least in the, how would you say, the southern Pacific Islands, that either through economic neglect or lack of commercial pressure, people have hung on to these heirloom varieties. They haven't been replaced by the high yielding commercial hybrids. And it's not just economic neglect. or lack of economic competition. It's also a matter of preference. The Samoans really took to cocoa and adopted it as almost their national crop, but certainly their national drink, Cocoa Samoa. So that variety here in the middle is a pretty typical Trinitario type, but it's called Laffy 7. So that's one of the sort of pretty well-known clones from Samoa. And the Samoans particularly appreciate the rather mild flavor of these drinks and the high butterfat content for making this product, which they drink as their sort of national beverage. It's sort of rather, sort of slightly oily, sweet cocoa drink. It's quite interesting. We'll talk a little bit later about adding value to these heirloom varieties. They don't compete in terms of sheer yield and volume, but perhaps you're perhaps left with a challenge to add value to them in other ways. And the Samoans obviously appreciate the particular taste and characteristics and so on, but they've also added their own story to it. According to the, if you'll see the sort of Samoan websites, the Spanish brought these cocoa varieties straight to Samoa from South America in the 16th century, whereas our molecular biology data, this kind of stuff, but done in Samoa, suggests that there was no separate introduction. It was brought in by German commercial interests to Samoa in about the 1870s. But you know, when you're selling a product like this, you're selling a story as well as a product. So good luck to them. The sad truth is that growing cocoa is just not a very commercially interesting or competitive activity. The price has been at around $2,500 a ton for about 10 years now. If you look a little bit back, I mean, I think the cocoa hit its peak price ever back in 1977, I think it was, when due to production problems in the main producer countries, it went up to about $5,000 a ton in modern terms, inflation adjusted terms. But to actually make money as a cocoa producer, you have to produce lots of cocoa like that, and you probably can't afford to pay in present time paid labor. And so it tends to be now become a smallholder crop where family labor does a lot of hard work on the farm. This is also part of the story. This actually, I wouldn't stick too strongly by the figures as a scientist, because this comes from an NGO called, I think it's called Make Chocolate Fair. So they were campaigning for better rights for farmers. But basically what you can see is, like so many commodity crops, the farmer gets a very small amount. So really you can only actually make chocolate money from cocoa by adding value to it, either yourself or, so we have what we call a short market chain. We are partly manufacturer and retailer as well. So we capture more of that value. So what's our basic strategy? We're starting with high quality, fine flavor cocoa, but the official, how would you say, the official premium for fine quality Trinitario cocoa is only about $500 a ton, which does not pay your labor. You have a short market tin and tell an appealing story. I suppose to try to make it truly sustainable, what we want to do is to minimize environmental damage. We're trying to be an ethical business, to produce a fair deal for suppliers, for our employers and employees, and for our customers. And we'd like to think that we're actually trying to tell a true story as well, not a fabricated one. So moving along quickly to try to tell you a bit more about how the business works. That's my partner Anne and I on the left as the investors who set this up, and on the right our Fijian team who are running the business, and hopefully will continue to do so. So from the top, Joeli, who's our farm manager and main tour guide, looks after the farm. Lena, who's our bookkeeper, office manager, guest relations, sort of financial brains, and Sam, the chocolate maker at the bottom, and then they're assisted by people like Saras in the kitchen at the bottom right, and Waisea, who's now retired on the farm. So that's about our team. We're a very small enterprise. We knew right from the beginning, I don't want to try to be smug because I'm not a businessman, but our business plan right from the beginning said that making chocolate, well, selling cocoa and even turning it into chocolate is not going to be a viable business proposition. So we set it up right from the beginning to be agro-ecotourism as well, and to try to promote sustainable production. I should say that we benefited from a little bit of learning by doing. My partner Anne went over to an operation in Mindo in Ecuador, where they were already doing this kind of thing. She worked with them for about a month. There she is doing a tour guide, partly in Spanish and partly in American to American tourists there. And they have an operation which in the end has turned out rather similar to ours. I don't think it's so much that we gained a lot of ideas from them. I think the ideas we had in our heads, but what it did give us was a lot of confidence that this was a feasible thing. And one thing I would also say is, if you look at that picture on the right, that's from a trade show in Quito where this Mindo chocolate was selling their wares. And you can see that Ecuador is way ahead of the Pacific in developing dozens of products from their chocolate and really promoting the value of their heirloom varieties based on what they call nacional, which is one of those basic cocoa types. So I'm going to quickly walk you through all three bits of our business, if you like. But this is the farm itself. We started off with an abandoned cassava farm back in 2012. Pretty much overgrown with creepers. And any of you who've grown anything in the tropics will know cassava is very hard on the soil. It was pretty much hammered, nothing much but weeds when we took over. So we quickly planted mucuna beans and lots of leguminous trees, lots of gliricidia, which is known in Central America as madre de cacao, mother of cocoa, lots of quick growing bananas, papayas, hardwood trees, and basically capture the land, get some shade in, build up some organic matter. And that's the farm, the same plot basically as it is, what are we, 8 years later. You can see this is gliricidia, some of the hardwoods, that's some mahogany that's grown. Most of them got blown over by the cyclones. And that's our processing shed right in the middle of amongst the cocoa. So we've got a setup on a hectare of land. We've got about 400 cocoa trees, but we've got about another 90 useful species of useful trees, fruits, nuts, spices, medicinal plants, things we can put in the chocolate, things we can eat or drink with the chocolate, and things that are also there just for their ecosystem services. So we've planned this, we manage it for resilience rather than maximum yield. We probably get a quarter of the yield that they would get on a cocoa farm intensively managed in Queensland. We're not certified organic. Doesn't seem to me to work for smallholders in the Pacific under present economics, but we do use some inorganic fertilizer, but along with lots and lots of compost. And I think our management emphasis is on soil health, building up the organic matter using ground covers, composting and recycling everything. Like everyone else in this region, we have two main challenges: Phytophthora pod rot, which we're trying to manage through tolerant varieties, lots of pruning to let in the light and air so that the trees dry out quickly after the frequent rain. Sanitation, we try to visit every tree every week and get rid of the infected pods. The other thing that's was rather surprised how severe they were. It was Pacific rats. They'll take up to 40% of your yield, and we've tried to keep them under biological control. The official recommendation is a heavy use of anticoagulant poisoning. We don't want to use that on the farm. So we have cats, and we put up nest boxes for owls, and we're trying to keep them under control that way. So if you like, the whole thing's a bit of a citizen science evaluating different varieties. We started off with 16 clones that were recommended mainly for their disease resistance by a cocoa breeder from the Papua New Guinea program. We got a lot of our starter materials from Wainingata and Nandrolola research stations. Fiji used to have its own breeding program back in the 1970s, and a lot of our material are these lovely red pods that came from the Wainingata breeding program. We get budwood from the National Collection. This is Joelle hard at work budding. We're trying to get blocks of trees so that we can start to really evaluate which of these varieties actually not only produce cocoa, but actually make decent chocolate. And do a bit of citizen science, looking at minimum fertilizer application rates, collecting data and so on. So you see a tree like this, it's had, the green ribbon says it's had compost, the orange ribbon says it's had 100 grams of NPK, the little yellow tag says it's had its DNA fingerprints taken, and so on. So that shed, which you caught a glimpse of in the middle of the farm, is what we call fermentation and drying shed. This is where we start the real transformation. The quality comes every step of the way. If you want decent chocolate, you have to really work at it. So starts with picking them only when they're ripe. Those shriveled beans in the Tlaxcala market were probably beans that had been picked too early. We let them dry for a few days, then we split them open. You can see we've been putting aside some of the different varieties. This is that funny one, the multicolored one from the Upper Amazon genetics. We've kept that separately here in the fermentation to see whether that makes decent chocolate, but otherwise all the mixed Trinitarios all go in together. Fermentation is absolutely key. When it comes at this stage fresh off the tree, the pulp is kind of sweet, tastes like soursop or custard apple. And if you bite into the bean, it just tastes vaguely planty and slightly bitter. To get any chocolate taste, you need to ferment it. And we use these kind of traditional wooden bins. We want to get this full. That's about 300, 400 pods. Runs for about 6 days of fermentation, 2 days in the top bin, 2 days middle bin, 2 days in the... We want to see the temperature climbing up towards about 40 degrees Celsius to get a good change in taste. The beginning, it's mostly yeasts doing the fermentation, so you get a kind of beery, bready smell. Towards the end, it goes more acidic, like a sort of wine or vinegar. That's when sort of acetifying bacteria are taking over, or lactic acid bacteria. You see we're monitoring the temperature. And on the 6th day, we start to cut beans open to make sure they're properly fermented. Quick rinse to try and get some of the pulp off. That's not done everywhere, but we find it's helpful to reduce the likelihood, the danger of any molding or we want to get a quick dry then, reduce the chances of a bacterial aftertaste from the thing. We've sun dry them. And then in grey, rainy weather, which we get a lot of, we use fans. We try to get a bit of a greenhouse effect going, but key innovation here is the chocolate factory is cooled by split system air conditioning. So we bring the waste heat from chilling the factory up here to keep the beans nice and warm and dry. So we are trying to get a nice clean product. And here we go into the chocolate. We leave it to mature at least 3 months in our storage room. Roast it. It's a milder roast than coffee. We do about half an hour at some time, somewhere between 110, 120 degrees Celsius. Crack it through a coarse grinder. So winnow to get rid of the seed coat. It's pretty standard procedure. And then that gives us our cocoa nibs. I guess the only thing I would say here is that almost everyone in the world adds extra cocoa butter. Now, we don't have a cocoa press, and we reckon that by working with these heirloom varieties that have a naturally high butterfat content, we can manage without extra cocoa butter. So we get pretty rich, mild flavor by using those heirloom varieties. They go into, this is an American conch, so it does 20 pounds of chocolate at a time. It runs for anywhere between 18 and 22 hours. That's getting rid of unwanted volatiles, getting rid of the water. We put our only ingredients are cocoa nibs and Fiji cane sugar, either 15% sugar or 30% sugar. Grinds up like that till you've got a nice smooth paste. If you just pour it like that, you get a kind of crumbly brown chocolate, which is all the mixtures, all the different kinds of cocoa butter fat. We only want cocoa butter fat form 5, which is the one that's sort of stable and melts at about 32 Celsius. So we go through this tabling or tempering on a cold stone table. This room is chilled, unlike the rest of Fiji, to about 20 degrees Celsius, and very importantly, down to about 40 to 50% relative humidity. You just can't make chocolate outdoors in Fiji. So before you take it warm out of the machine at about 50 Celsius, you let it bring down to, you work it on the table till it's down to about 28 Celsius, and you pop it back in the bowl with a bit of warm chocolate, bring it back up to 32, and then you pour it. And if it's worked, you get a nice, shiny bar to click to it. And this used to be our flagship product, with just chocolate with a very minimum of flavoring, what we say a hint of this and a hint of that. So it's 85% plain chocolate, 70% plain chocolate, then chocolate with sea salt from the Lau Islands, or chili from the Singatoka Valley, or a bit of our experiment with cultural fusion, a bit of chai masala from the Indian community, the other side of the island in Mombasa. So that's seemed to work reasonably well. Since COVID, we've been trying to sell more into the local market, which likes sweeter things, and probably is not really prepared to pay enough for chocolate to make it worth the effort. So we've done things, we're trying to make a strength of local products. Fiji grows really good ginger. So we do ginger coated in plain chocolate. We do coconut bars coated with chocolate, and we do, for the health enthusiasts, we do cocoa nibs with just put on your granola, and various other odds and ends, but I won't get too much into that. In the long run, we'd like to use a lot more of our local products, our own ginger, our own turmeric, our own local nuts like tavola, sea almond, vutu nuts, Barringtonia. But we're not at that stage yet. We're building up our quantities of all these things and working out the products. So, turning to the ecotourism, our signature bean to sort of tree to bar tour, we do a fairly intensive experience. People often ask us, how do you spend so long? But our tours take about 2 hours, which is quite a long time for a small farm and a very small factory, but we try to tailor it to the interests of the particular group. But some of them are just interested in birds and plants, and others are really interested in chocolate. So you try and encourage them to sort of understand the bits of the system that relate to the bit that they're interested in, I suppose you'd say. So the sustainable farming. This is the fermentation shed. Look there. We also always say, touch it, feel it, taste it, and then put your pictures online. There they are, seeing, gosh, it's really warm, the fermentation bin, etc. This was actually our very first tour. A family from France, from Toulon, no, Toulouse, I think it was. We've really enjoyed getting the word out, meeting lots of people from literally all around the world. In the last month, I think we started to have yachties coming back to Fiji through the Blue Lane, and we've had people from France and Belgium and Argentina and UK and Canada. So it really is a great way to get to know people from all around the world. The sort of biodiversity on the farms become a key part of our message. We have a little tiny creek, but it runs all year round. And we like to say that's because of our forest cover and the good hydrology. Runs straight into the sea. It's walking distance to the nearest coral reef. So we really hammer on the clean environment, no pesticides, no herbicides. We don't let fertilizer get in the creek. We're rewarded by a high diversity the creek is only about 500 yards long, but it has, I think, 12 species of freshwater fish, about 7 or 8 species of prawns. So it really is biodiversity in action. This is for then we try to do the message of the plant biodiversity. For instance, that strange looking thing in the middle is the larva of the Fiji swallowtail, Fiji's largest butterfly. And it feeds on gingila, which is a rutaceae. That's an important medicinal plant for Fijians. They use it to treat sore throats and chest infections and things. And just by having that tree around, we've got a sort of little population explosion of the Fiji swallowtail butterfly. And we mentioned the ylang ylang trees, the kananga earlier. That's a barking dove, which, like other Fijian fruit doves, loves the seeds of mokosoi. We try to mix a bit of fun There's Fiji's biggest insect sitting on this lad's head, the giant stick insect. These are our rodent management officers. A lot of the younger visitors spend a lot of time with the cats and the dogs. But you know, what we're trying to do is even things like the cats, we're saying, okay, they are part of controlling rats without using poisons. You know, they're not just there as companion animals. And we've tried to branch out and day events, chocolate fiesta, anything you can eat and talk about chocolate. We've done chocolate workshops, teaching people how to make chocolate, letting them have a go for themselves, making their own Easter eggs. Sort of by accident, we've kind of got the word out on multimedia. I think Travel Salad, we hear, is the most popular travel show on Japanese TV, though I must admit I've never seen it and couldn't get the website to work. More accessible to us, the French version of Survivor came visiting. I have no idea how our message of eco-responsabilité reached all the way to Paris, but they turned up one day with 4 survivors who'd managed to survive a month on Kandavu, fending for themselves. And they, of course, they were delighted to eat as much chocolate as their attendant medical officer would allow them. And they had a shot at making chocolate. And I guess that was seen by, I think, an average viewership of 5 million French people every evening watch Survivor, apparently. So I don't know, I don't think it had any effect on our business, but it was kind of funny to see how unreal reality TV is. And of course, we work with Fiji Broadcasting and the local press to try and get the word out. And that word is not just about come and eat lots of nice chocolate. We're trying to emphasize sustainable production techniques. More formally, we work with, this is Sefa, who's the local agricultural officer from Dr Research Station, ACPIR from the KokoForestry department at SPC. You probably gathered from along the way somehow that my pet hate at the moment is kava. Well, everybody who's lost their jobs in the Fiji tourist industry due to COVID has gone back to the land to make to grow crops. And of course, the easiest way to make cash is to grow kava, and the easiest way to grow kava is to cut down the rainforest like there's no tomorrow. So there's a huge rate of deforestation at the moment. And it's completely unsustainable. The soil washes away in no time. The fertility goes down the drain after one crop of kava. And the sad thing is that kava grows beautifully. This is kava, the wicked plant itself. It grows beautifully in traditional systems in agroforestry. So we're trying as hard as we can to get that word out. COVID, of course, has cut off our lifeblood. Our short market chain was mostly selling chocolate and tours to tourists. But in the absence of tourists, we've tried to, well, survive, but also by sort of pivoting, if you like, to the local market, selling chocolate to slightly more prosperous people in Suva, but also reaching out to communities. There's the hope that the future of tourism in our island, in Vanuatu, is through community-based and sustainable tourism, community-based, nature-based tourism. So our little bit of it is to work with this community, with Nature Fiji, Marangeti Viti, to develop community-based tourism on the Natewa Peninsula. And along the way, we hope very much to save this butterfly, which was only described for science towards the end of 2018. Within about 6 weeks of the publication of the description in a very obscure entomological journal in Germany, collectors were there in Fiji from Japan, China, New Zealand, and even France to collect this butterfly. And you see that unfortunate butterfly in that picture. That was for sale on the internet in Paris for 6,000 euros. So we were perhaps rather lucky that the COVID travel ban intervened only a few weeks later, and that's given us a year and a half to try and get ourselves organized to try to breed the butterfly in this butterfly house here and get the community mobilized to realize that this butterfly is worth more to them as an ecotourism asset, worth more to them alive as a product of their beautiful rainforest, and to stop cutting down the rainforest for kava and to look for other sources of income. So that's become a bit of a passion and a bit of a mission. And then the very last few weeks, we've been working again. This is another another grant we got from the German embassy in Wellington to work with other sustainable tourism operators from Mukambati and Ocean Ventures, promoting, they called it a conservation leadership initiative. These are kids from communities on the north coast of Vanuatu that were completely devastated by Cyclone Yasa last year. And so we've sort of been taking a message out to promote a sort of ridge to reef approach to land management with youth groups. And then the youth groups made such a fuss back in their villages that the elders wanted to come and see what was going on. So we've been trying to push this message that, okay, the weather may be an act of God, but when you get a flood and all the soil washes off your hillside and your river gets blocked and your village gets flooded, that's the result of human folly. That's the result of bad land management decisions. So you can do something about it. So a lot of these kids are now busy planting trees and stuff. So that's been quite gratifying too. I don't think we would have probably, if we'd just been running our normal chocolate business with the tourists, we probably wouldn't have got around to this for another year or two, but it's been good to be really encouraged to get on with that because it is an urgent thing to be done. Finally, I want to leave you some time to ask questions and things. Just a bit of a reflection about the future. The history of our company in a few sentences was that we registered the company, I think my last week of working for ACIR in March 2018. It took us about 15 months to get all the permits necessary to do business in Fiji. So we opened on the 1st of July 2019. We operated, as I say, mostly with tourists coming to Savu Savu, which is a fairly quiet place. We operated for about 6 months, and I think we were just about breaking even, starting to turn a modest profit on operations when COVID shut down the tourist industry. But I think it was good. I think we'd shown the viability of the business model. So then we had about a year and a half of hanging on. It's been a difficult year. Last Christmas, which is usually a good time for visitors, we only had one visitor. It was a Category 5 cyclone, tropical cyclone Yasa, which, as you can see from that picture, knocked over a lot of the leguminous shade trees and crushed a lot of the cocoa. So last Christmas was a bit dismal working with the chainsaw. But so, you know, you get over these things. We try to be resilient. And so looking ahead, you know, we think that our model is okay. There's a bright future in the Pacific for dark chocolate, you know, the single origin chocolate, telling the story of how it got there and how we grow it and how it's now part of local culture and so on. More sustainable agriculture, absolutely key to the future survival of Fiji and other Pacific islands. So if we can use chocolate to get that message over to people in general, policymakers, governments, and punters and farmers. I guess the big question is, we're dependent on tourist income to make the thing economically viable. In the last year when we had tourists, we had 5 of those boats came into Savu Savu. They're a bit of a shock because on one of those cruise ships, there's about 3,500 people, and the total population of Savu Savu is only 5,000 people. So you can imagine it's a bit of a shock when those people disgorge. Most of those trinkets along the street there actually sell things made in the Philippines and Indonesia, because that's what tourists seem to want, cheap and cheerful. We think it would be nice if they'd be a bit more interested in Fijian culture and Pacific artifacts and stuff. And I think there's an economic point to be made as well. You know, they go and visit, they do village tours where they pay the village $10 a head to go and, you know, have a look around the village, visit the waterfall and so on, learn about Pacific culture. The cruise company is selling that same tour to the tourists on the ship for 80 to 90 Australian dollars per head. So, you know, that's not really a fair crack of the whip, is it? So what we would like to see is when tourism does reopen, is it too much to hope? There's going to be a rush just to get the numbers back, but is there any hope that more responsible tourists will come back who will care a bit more about the environment, about Pacific culture, about the people that they're visiting, and that therefore that there's a brighter future for communities and the environment in the Pacific. I'm not going to go through all this, but I would like to leave that on the screen because this has been very much a social enterprise, both the people we work with, but all the people many of you who are actually listening in today. So thank you for all the help you've given us and encouragement along the way. And those are some of the people who've really helped us get up and started and doing, I think, what's potentially a beautiful thing and a sustainable thing. And we hope to go on working with you to spread the word wider in the Pacific. Thanks.
Thanks so much for sharing your work with us today. That was a very interesting presentation. And I believe you covered the journey of sustainable chocolate and how it can be used in community-based tourism really well. If only we could all come and meet and have a tour and taste of the KokoMana chocolate. Definitely that's
I hope you will. We very much hope you all will, because that's how we get the word out, as people coming to visit and then taking the word on elsewhere.
Definitely. Well, it's definitely on my list, so I'll be there soon. Now we are going to allow some time for questions. We've got about 10 minutes, which is great. A few people have already popped their questions in the chat, so thank you, and we will try to get to all of those questions. If anyone else does have questions, obviously pop them in the chat. We'll try to address them. But I'll go to the first question, Richard, that was popped in there a little bit earlier on in the presentation. And the question is, how effective is the fermentation process based on ambient conditions? It's sort of a two-part question. Does improving the drying process add any values in terms of organoleptic quality and market value to the dried cacao bean? I think I've probably pronounced that wrong.
Yeah, the key to good fermentation is to have the right amount of moisture content. It's good to let it dry a little bit. Those are kind of, we want an aerobic fermentation. That sort of sweet slush drains out quite quickly. We call it sweatings. We use that as a fertilizer. It's incredibly complex process. A paper that's just sent to me this week by Eric Huttner from doing some research from CIRAD shows that the flavor compounds come both from the genetics of the bean, but also they come from the yeast, from the bacteria, and from the interaction of the two. So there's great complexity there. I mean, a vat of wine is usually fermented by one or sometimes two species of Saccharomyces, whereas the work that QDAF's done in Vanuatu, they find 10, 12 different species of yeast in an average vat of cocoa. So all I'd say is it's very complex. That's what probably less the genetics of the plant, but more the fermentation conditions that give you the complexity of the flavor. And we don't fully understand the process. You could spend another lifetime researching that with all the tools of molecular biology, and there's still a lot to find there. The thing about the drying, I would say, is it's mainly avoiding problems. You want to stop any bacterial fermentation, and you want to get rid of some of the bacterial off tastes, but you don't want to lose all the fruitiness. So you don't really want a lot more bacterial activity in there. So hence we try to get it dry as quickly as possible. We like sunny days, but of course we don't always get those in Fiji.
Great, thanks.
But we do think that sort of process, there's actually scientific evidence suggesting that the low temperature drying is better in terms of developing a full and complex flavor than sticking it on a grain dryer as one might in high-tech production.
Great, thanks, Richard. I've noticed that Professor Paul Itchy has his hand up, so I think he has a question for you as well.
Thanks, Bridget, and thanks, Richard, for a very interesting presentation. I think it's very timely because I have been speaking about fruit tree production in Fiji since I came, and I didn't actually realize until recently that you were producing cocoa in Savu. I think there's a need for farmers to learn this the other side of agriculture, because Fijians are doing agriculture just the way they did it or are doing it in my place. A lot of hard labor with not much returns, except maybe from kava. But I think this is the approach, and especially with the fact that it can be combined with tourism, as you have demonstrated. Sorry, I was suggesting we could send you some wildlife, but I don't think baboons and monkeys would be appropriate. They would destroy your cocoa, which is what I'm going to battle with when my cashews start producing. But when I set up my cashew farm, that was exactly what I had in mind. I have spaced out my own trees. I can see you have only about, as much, not only, but as much as 400 trees on the hectare. I have a much bigger area than that, and I planted only about close to 700 cashew trees. So they are about 10 meters apart. And I did that because I want to introduce goats on the site as well at some point when the trees can be better protected. So that is the way it should be done. Mixed farming, and they're not just farming, but bringing in some tourists to the picture, because the tourists go to these places, they hop from island to island when they come, and so it would be another revenue earner for the farmers instead of just planting cassava and tallow. So well done, and I think I'm not sure whether the locals visit you, but I think they need to learn this a lot more and not just focus on cocoa, because I even thought you learned about cocoa from Southwest Nigeria, where you were based. I was disappointed that it wasn't from there. But I think they can do more. And I think cashews are actually easier to do than cocoa. So I think that's the direction Fiji should go. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. We actually have 3 cashew trees. We'll report back on how they do once they mature. But more seriously, before COVID, we were actually discussing with some of your colleagues to have some of your postgrad students come as interns, as the in the farm to try out some of these different things. So once things are back to normal after COVID, I hope we'll take up that idea again.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul and Richard. There are lots of questions coming through in the chat. So I apologize if I've missed anyone's comments, but I'm hoping to get through them all. There's another question here from David Richard, and he has asked, is a secure power supply a problem for you as it is on many islands?
No, we're very blessed. We tried to go solar initially to part of our, but we were defeated when it came to setting up the chocolate factory, and we needed decent air conditioning. I think it would be possible in Australia because there's sort of better batteries and more efficient air conditioners are readily available. We were defeated on that, but we still try to, we have a huge, heavily insulated building. We try to minimize our power use to be ecologically responsible, but we would be in hard time without an electricity supply for the factory. Everything else runs all right on solar.
Okay, well, that's good. That's good to hear, Richard. The second part of David's question, he also was wondering if noticed impacts of COVID on food security, or if there has been any impacts, and if they've been positive as well as negative.
I mean, I think we're relatively lucky on our island, Vanuatu. We have a very low population density. I don't know if people realize this, but 1/3 of the population of Fiji lives in Suva. So the rest of the archipelago is underpopulated, if you like. But so people have come back to the villages. On the whole, that has put quite a lot of strain on the natural resource base, with incautious agricultural practices. But I don't think people on the whole have gone hungry, because the wonderfully resilient social system of Fiji, people have fed each other. They've reabsorbed family members and helped them to find land and grow food. So, and there's much more local food production. We're dependent less on fruit and veg imported from Australia and New Zealand. So that's been a positive thing, I think. Lots of diverse food products developing.
Well, that's good. Another question here from CC. Sorry, I'm just sort of firing you questions here.
No, it's good. I'll try and be brief.
CC is curious to know if you use cocoa from your farm, only from your farm, or if you also buy cocoa pods from other Fijian cocoa growers. And with the seasonality of cocoa, is cocoa supply a problem for you?
It's always been our intention that we should buy. We grow roughly half of what we need. We buy the rest from other suppliers. So one of the things we hope we can do is to help local suppliers to understand what's needed for, high grade, get a decent, high quality cocoa for chocolate making, because frankly, most of the cocoa produced in Fiji in the past has been rather low grade, sort of bulk grade. And if they want to get into these high value markets, selling to, small scale chocolate makers and so on, who will pay maybe twice the world commodity price for cocoa, they need to up their game. So yeah, we do buy in. We've been very fortunate to work with a family from Manoa and Ana Raika, who are doing things right because they won a Cocoa of Excellence competition in Paris at the first shot in 2019. So they're doing something right. We buy from them, but it's very much part of the idea that we would like to help lift the standards and the operations and the sustainability of the local industry. And that's partly by not just buying it ourselves, but once there is a surplus in the market, we'll help to link people up to small scale chocolate makers in Australia and New Zealand who can pay a good price, a fair price.
Thanks, Richard. I think we've got time for maybe just 2 more questions, because I've realised we've passed 1 p.m. there. Must be a very interesting presentation, Richard, for everyone with this many questions. But this question's from Floris, and they ask, for your agritourism operation, will you include or connect to Fijian culture to incorporate in the chocolate and tours in a more demonstrative way?
Yes, I mean, I think we're not going to pretend to be Fijians. We already, our Fijian guides introduce quite a strong cultural element, telling people about their uses of the plants and so on, and how they prepare food. And we prepare, if we do offer refreshments, we try to prepare Fijian style food. But I think what we see our role there is more acting as a link and helping these communities that we work with, helping them to develop the sort of Fijian cultural based tourism. So, take an example. I've planted paper mulberry, so we could do demonstrations of making tapa cloth. But I would so much rather say to them, look, we've been working with Vusarato Eco Tours. Take the bus journey, 1 hour up the road, go to Vusarato. They will show you how they make tapa cloth with their traditional way. They'll give you a traditional Fijian meal, and you'll get to know how a real Fijian community does that, rather than a simulation on my farm. We like to try to make people aware of those opportunities, but we don't see it as big. We see us wanting to have cultural content and cultural responsibility, but we don't see that. We see our role as being mainly as a go-between to promote that for others to do, I guess.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, well, last question. I do apologise to everybody else who has popped questions in the chat there. Maybe we can give them to Richard after the presentation and he can
yes, honestly, if anyone wants to email me questions, I'm very happy to dialogue on Facebook or whatever. Yeah. We do have a website and a Facebook page which is quite active. We already chat back and forth with quite a lot of people on all sorts of things.
Great, thanks, Richard. Well, the final question, which I think is quite fitting, and you may have covered this in your presentation, but Caroline has asked, where is your product available for consumers?
Is that a consumer in Australia or in, because at the moment it's only available in Fiji. We sell through a couple of retail outlets in Savu and Governor's Cafe in Suva, but otherwise we do direct orders to people in Viti Levu. We've so far been defeated by the thought of all the paperwork involved in trying to do exports. So I think that's down the road. That's for phase 2, when somebody with more money buys us out and I can retire properly.
Sure, I can imagine that phase is a lot more complicated than this first phase. Well, you've done a really awesome job, Richard, and thank you very much for your presentation and taking the time to talk with us today. And thank you everyone else for joining us. It was lovely to see some new faces as well and some familiar faces. If you did enjoy the seminar today and would like to be added to our mailing list, please let us know, or add your name and your email to the chat and we will follow it up. Otherwise, we will see you again in our next seminar series in October. So thank you, Richard. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much for your interest.